Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar Having Conversations about Race in the Classroom with Stephanie Jirard. My name is Jill Ragusa and I am the Field Marketer for Criminology and Criminal Justice at Sage Publishing. This one-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will be sending out a link to view it to all registrants in the coming weeks. If any of you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the right of your screen and one of our helpful team members will get back to you ASAP. At the end of the webinar, we will have some time for Q&A from attendees, so please use the Q&A box to ask any questions to the speaker throughout the webinar. Please also take note of the webinar hashtag #SageTalks, and feel free to ask questions or leave comments there. Let me begin by introducing you to our speaker. Stephanie Jirard is the Title IX Coordinator and a Professor of Criminal Justice at Shippensburg University and has received training on how to lead courageous conversations on race. Prior to teaching at Shippensburg, she was a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy's Judge Advocate General Corps and served as a trial attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Division, a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office, an assistant public defender at the Federal Public Defender's Office, and a death penalty defense lawyer with the Missouri Public Defender's Capital Litigation Unit. As a professional coach, she also provides training on diversity and inclusion to organizations and agencies surrounding race, gender, LGBTQ, mental health, and the differently abled. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Stephanie Jirard.
Thank you, Jill, and also Jessica Miller and all the people at SAGE for inviting me to speak with you today about how to develop your voice to lead students in race-based conversations. Now, right out of the gate, I want to assure you that you are qualified to talk about race in America, whether you grew up here or not, and regardless of your identity, because all you need is a willingness to share your experiences with race, to speak your truth, and a willingness to listen to others. Now, I'm going to give you a basic outline and some helpful hints for your discussions, but let me make it clear that silence on the topic of race with your students is no longer an option. Though the slow suffocation of George Floyd under the policeman's knee has led to a sustained focus on structural inequality in America, by you embracing race dialogue openly, honestly, and consistently, you can stake your claim to helping transform America. And it's actually working. Because never in my lifetime did I think I would see a vote to change the state flag of Mississippi. So thank you for being willing to make a difference. Next slide, please. Now, to begin today, I'm going to focus exclusively on anti-Black racism, although my suggestions may be used in different contexts, and I am using the Bureau of Census descriptions of Black and white, and I myself identify as a Black woman. Now, our discussions begin with America assigning value as a human based exclusively on skin color, and how enduring images and emotional associations sort of support government policies that appear to treat people equally, but in reality treat Black people as less than. Now, the study of semiotics, as this slide illustrates, is really the study of signs and the automatic association of an image or a thing with some emotional response. And because of the automatic association of human value and skin color, if you study semiotics, and especially through advertising, you can understand how being Black in America as an image means something different than equality. And it's just, again, advertising. You know, from an ad on Coca-Cola or a Coca-Cola drink. Oh, it's refreshing and teaches the world to sing, for example. You think of that once you see an image of a Coke. Next slide, please. Now, people in general are good, and that's something to remember. We all have good hearts and good intentions. But in our history of slavery, it was problematic because for good people to destroy black families by buying and selling them as chattel on the auction block, they needed some sort of justification for treating black people that way. Religious doctrine of the day spoke of bringing salvation to savages. And science, which was little more than hocus pocus at the time in the 1700s, elevated itself to a position of authority by classifying Homo sapiens, justifying the supremacy of the white, big brain, beautiful ideal, as you see in the slide, over the black, small brain, primitive ape. Next slide, please. So this ape/animal association, this othering of the black person to justify treating us inhumanely, it still resonates today. It does not matter if you've reached the pinnacle of success politically. You are still an animal, as you see here, the President, Barack Obama and Mrs. Obama. Or, if you'll see on the next slide, please, you could be a child advertising the H&M hoodie as you are the coolest monkey in the jungle. Now, the separation of black people from the human race has meant for our institutions of government the permissive exclusion of our bodies and the silence of our voices. It also means that identifying black people as the other, it means that we, as black people, are blamed and we are responsible for our current status. We are something that needs to be fixed rather than society's viewpoints and government institutions need to be rectified. We, as black people, are responsible for our own lack of access to true equality. If only we would do something differently. This is what is defined as racism. And we see it in the government distribution of services in our schools and distribution of services in healthcare, distribution of services in mortgage rates and where we live, and especially in criminal justice, which is my area. Next slide, please. Because if you think about how you have to discipline beasts, punishment has to be brutal to be memorable. Now here's a video capture of former Atlanta police officer Rolfe kicking Rayshard Brooks after shooting him and he lay dying. Now the treatment of black people is rooted in this history, and we must grapple with the racial biases created for us and which we carry. So here, the kick, what it represents is even though you're down and mortally wounded, you still don't get it. Black people still need to be punished more harshly than others because we are not thought to exhibit the traits of humans with which you treat with dignity and respect. Next slide, please. So since we've been fed a steady diet of racist narratives, what that means is when we want to talk about race, as the Courageous Conversation series says, we often race to racism. That is, since we only talk about race in the context of slavery, oppression, Dr. King, Black History Month, my white brothers and sisters may feel bad about our history and shut down. And when black people want to talk about race, many assume we're charging racism. So the end result is nobody wants to talk about race. Next slide, please. So to illustrate what I mean, the Courageous Conversation series asks, to what degree does race impact my life? And I'd like you to take 10 seconds and come up with a percentage as an answer. Now the answer is, of course, 100%. But people may give lower percentages because they interpreted the question to mean how much interaction with or time spent thinking about other races. Next slide, please. But really, to think about to what degree does race impact my life, it's 100% because we operate in the world as the race that we are. And we are either given certain advantages or not based on how other people perceive us. So to get ready to engage in discussions about race in the classroom, you have to prepare yourself, and then you have to relate to the students, and then you have to debrief the class discussion. And rinse and repeat, and rinse and repeat. So my suggestions are both for face-to-face and online classrooms. If in an online platform such as D2L or Blackboard or Canvas allows for real-time conversations, great. If not, no worries, because in response to the discussion prompts that you may put up on your discussion boards, students get what my friend calls keyboard courage. And they actually will spend a lot of time crafting thoughtful responses to race-based prompts because they don't have the fear of looking at their classmates out of the corner of their eye and of saying something wrong or inappropriate. So don't be afraid to have these conversations online. It actually may be easier in the long run. So how do you prepare yourself? As I said at the beginning, you're already an expert of your own life and you have the authority to speak for you. There are many resources available with a few clicks on the web, and some are better than others. And we, along with Sage, are working on a list of resources that may be helpful for you. But you don't have to wait for that. You can click today. But don't let your study of the issue steal your authentic voice. That is, don't get an article that you enjoy and then start copying what these people say and to bring into the classroom. Like, you should be you. And when you're preparing yourself, you have to spend a lot of time reflecting. You have to be clear about how you feel about big ticket racial items and issues in our society today that often proliferate in this space. For example, how do you feel about authority, about our history, about our government, about the police, about defunding the police, about Black Lives Matter, about the rejoinder, all lives matter? How do you feel about the term white supremacy or white fragility or white privilege? And to be clear, what privilege means is just freedom. Freedom from fear in how you move about your community, how you move about the country. The fact that you don't have to think twice when you go and apply for a mortgage, that somebody might question the source of your income or whether or not you indeed are a legitimate purchaser of a home. That's what privilege means, freedom from fear. But when you plan your classroom discussions, plan how you're going to relate to the students, because these types of discussions, you need to create certain relationships of trust. What stories about yourself will you share? For example, when I go on a job interview, I have 5 stories I'm going to tell in my 20 minutes, regardless of the question. I'm going to talk about my time as a Navy JAG. I'm going to talk about my time working for Attorney General Janet Reno. I pick my stories beforehand because they tell who I am and define my values. You should do this too in having race-based conversations. What stories about you and race, or your thoughts about these issues, are you willing to share? Because students will expect you to be honest when you're having these conversations. And then you plan a debrief. And a debrief is just, you have to check in. That is, you should not be planning these discussions in the last 20 minutes of a lecture. You should devote an entire classroom period for them, and you should always plan some type of wrap-up. And again, even online, you want to check in. How is everyone feeling? How did it all go? Anything I can do better. You're always looking for feedback. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. You're always going to let your students correct you and offer helpful suggestions. They want you to succeed in this. They need you to teach them how to talk about race. That's what they're actually paying us for, to give them the tools to be fluid and live in a multicultural world and be successful in that world. They need us to do this for them. Okay, so now you're in the classroom in person or virtually. Now what? You announce the topic of the day. Could be the season of the National Reckoning on Race, whatever is happening in the country, or a current event. So, for example, just recently, the Wilmington, North Carolina police officer, he said recently that he'd like to wipe Black people off the face of the earth. And any news story of the day can be used, and it's current, and the students are probably thinking about it, and you are too, and you can just pick something and make it timely. Okay, so I'm just using that as an example. So to distinguish the one bad apple discussion, because this often happens in criminal justice, well, these police officers that are engaged in this behavior, they're just bad apples. And I should just say, you know, and some of this is true. 90% of my students, criminal justice students, and the people in the field are good and decent. But what is it about the culture that keeps leading to these types of incidents that we see on social media, where Black people are dying at the hands of government authority? Okay, so, you know, how are you going to ease into this discussion? Okay, next slide, please. So the first thing you should do, and this is type of pulse training, a sustained dialogue, but Dr. Hal Saunders, his type of training, says you should establish ground rules. As in any discussion that may evoke strong emotions, it helps to have the class define sort of safety rules. And I don't mean safety as in we're not going to engage in conversations that may evoke powerful emotions. I just mean, you know, how to have a list that is going to guide the discussion. And the more the class helps define that type of appropriate behavior, it's going to help you. So, for example, you might make a list that says be respectful. That's something that everyone's going to do. But what does that actually mean? Have the class come up with specific examples. You can't be too generic. So here's another ground rule. Everyone, if we're going to disagree, we're going to disagree with the statement made, not the person. Not going to attack the people in the room. You could make a ground rule that everything said in the classroom is confidential, and this includes the online environment. What we say here stays here because this is a learning environment and we need to move forward, and people need to feel that what they say is not going to come back and to haunt them, that this is a learning experience. You should make a ground rule that somebody speaking about race is offering their personal perspective, and they're not a representative of their entire race. So this often happens to me as a Black woman. I'm often asked for the Black perspective. And in these situations, I often feel like whatever I say, people are going to take as, oh, the whole Black race is speaking through Stephanie Jirard, and that's simply not true. So that could be a ground rule. And then you could also make a ground rule that when you examine stereotypes that are very common in our culture, we've been force-fed them, as I said, through the study of semiotics. You want to question and establish, where do these stereotypes come from? How were they formed? Was it based on personal experience, or is it from the media? Get the students to question how these ideas came to be. So if you establish norms right at the outset of the conversation, then you can check in with the group if norms are being upheld or violated. So you're having a conversation, someone is disrespectful, you can all just pull it back, check in and say, hey, let's go back to our list, our norms being followed. All right, now this is a picture of a cup. So what does this cup represent? To start heavy conversations, I always cut up my class list and I put all their names in this cup. And then I pull them out randomly, one by one. This eliminates the need for volunteers. This also eliminates those people, minimizes those people who want to dominate conversations like this. They may feel like they're an expert. And I go through the whole cup talking about one issue. And my rule is everybody speaks once before anybody speaks twice. If you're doing this online, there's a Google service that has sort of a random number picker, if you will. And so you can assign students numbers 1 through 10, and you have the Google computer program, pick a number, and that's the student who will begin, but everybody has to speak. And this will get those who are typically quiet or they're sitting on the sidelines. I saw a great cartoon representation of what it's like to speak about race, and it was of an iceberg. So understand that even when people are silent, you know, only like 10% of the iceberg is showing in public and 90% is underneath. I'm not necessarily saying to be afraid of the silence. Silence sometimes means that people are thinking, but you have to establish this trust relationship so that people feel that they can actually speak. So the cup, speaking and getting everyone to engage is the way that I do it. Takes the pressure off to do the cup. All right, next slide, please. So the easiest segue into a discussion about race is to ask the students to share how they see the world based on their identity. And again, this is a suggestion from the Sustained Dialogue Institute. What glasses, what eyes are they looking at the world through? What were the forces that shaped who they are and their worldview? Of course, the regular bodies, the regular people in their lives that you expect, parents, extended family, school, houses of worship, sororities, fraternities, media, friends, books. And once students talk about these things, you want to ask 3 things. Number 1, how? How did these forces shape how they see the world, how the student sees issues? Did they have any control over this shaping? So how and then did. Because I've had these conversations, lots of people come up to me and say, oh, you know, my grandmother used to talk about racist issues at the Thanksgiving table. I knew it was wrong, I was uncomfortable with it, but I had no control over it. And you want to explore those issues, how just being sort of silent witness to these events may have shaped their worldview. And the last question is what? What does the student plan to do to increase awareness from themselves, their own identity, and to share their own identity and worldview with others, or how their identity and worldview impacts others, especially in relation to race? And you can see this online over and over again, young people engaging in people that make offensive posts, and they responding and letting people know that it's offensive, but how does that activity affect everybody? So at SHIP, I was having a conversation, that's what we call Shippensburg, and for example, this is an example how worldview, this woman was sharing how sometimes during Greek Rush Week, she identified as a woman of color, and she would see that the white sororities, predominantly white sororities, would sort of reach out to people that look like them in order to join, but when she went close to the table, sort of everyone turned around and didn't even acknowledge that she existed. Now, I'm sure that the people at the table, the sorority in the table, are just simply not thinking about how their actions may impact others. They're just thinking, well, maybe this isn't a good recruit for what we're looking for. But you don't know unless you have these discussions. Okay, next slide, please. Now, as you're preparing to have these discussions, you should always prepare in advance for an off-ramp. Discussions about race may get too heated. And this is because of the violence often associated with our government practices and the social movements associated with them. So, for example, recently in the news, I saw a photo of a couple. They were in St. Louis. They were personal injury attorneys, and a group of peaceful protesters that I could see looked multiracial was walking down their residential street, and the attorneys came out locked and loaded with firearms. I've heard, and I'm sure as you have, that when in these situations, and I'm not talking about looting, and I'm not defending the looting here, but I'm talking about just people who are protesting. They're run down by cars. Recently shots were fired. In other types of social justice movements that you have, LGBTQ, women's rights in the 70s, they don't generate this type of violent response. But when you're talking about racial social justice, there is this overlay of violence. And of course, what brings us to this conversation is the violence that we've witnessed, particularly against unarmed Black men. So when these type of conversations generate heated emotions, you need an off-ramp. And an off-ramp, let me be clear, is not an excuse to abandon the discussion of race. You want to be careful to avoid attempts by students and others to bring in a discussion of intersectionality with other movements and other oppressed peoples. I often get that. Oh, but what about being in a different marginalized community? When you're having race-based conversations, you want to keep the focus on race. But when it gets too heated, the off-ramp is sort of a backup to a broader, generic question about race that keeps the focus but can diffuse some of the heat. So, for example, you could say, well, and let's just take a step back, class. In '63, Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech. If he were alive today, what speech would he give? So keeps the discussion on race, but it's pretty generic. Here's another one. The Declaration of Independence states all men are created equal. Has the definition of equality changed over time based on race? So it's a safety valve, if you will, but you have to plan them in advance and you have to know when to use them. And it will be pretty obvious because you will have sort of lost control of the conversation. But again, keep your focus. Don't abandon the conversation. Next slide, please. Now, when a toxic ideology is discussed, you may then have to turn from an open-ended set of discussion prompts, what do you think, how do you feel, to a more pointed Socratic method to get at the root of the issue. And you're going to, again, have to prepare to take this on. Now, I give as an example here Dylan Roots, who murdered Black parishioners in 2015 in Charleston, South Carolina, in church, because in the words of his confession, which you can watch on YouTube, he had to stop Black men from raping white women. He essentially said someone had to do it. And again, this is just an illustration of how this Black beast trope is still alive and well today. So some in my section of the country, close to the Gettysburg battlefield, will say that the Confederate flag is heritage, not hate. So let's say a student brings this forward. And you need to, again, you want to remain non-judgmental, which is very difficult to do. But if you start saying what is right and wrong, students will shut down. So you have to remain open, even though some of the discussion may seem to evoke strong reactions. Okay, so to the student who is willing to say the flag is heritage, not hate, you have to say, so why did the Civil War happen? You plan out a sort of deductive reasoning. Well, the Civil War happened because of states' rights. Okay, rights over what? Well, economic freedom. Okay, well, what was the agrarian Southern economy based on in terms of labor? Oh, well, free labor, right? Black slaves. All right, we had a civil war and the federal government won that war. And the Supreme Court has upheld the doctrine of federal supremacy. So there's no longer an issue that states have rights that they can override the feds with. So today, what does the Confederacy represent? Since that question has been answered. And then you'll have to be open to what their views are. And then you go in and say a little bit more pointedly, can you understand how Black people could see the Confederate flag as seeking to go back in time when blacks were subjugated under white control? Could you see how black people could see this flag as a reassertion of white dominance and white supremacy over black people? And then, okay, we don't know what their answer would be. And let's just say, well, no, they don't see it that way. Well, even if you don't feel that way, you could engage the student. Can you understand how the flag may cause black people psychic pain or mental distress? Since so many acts of violence, such as with Dylan Roof, are committed sort of in its colors, for its colors, to uphold what the flag means. Can you understand that for black people is really beyond uncomfortable? And then if they say, well, yeah, but that, I can't control what other people feel, you could say, well, knowing that this is how black people feel about the flag, are you okay with that? Are you okay with allowing the flag to fly when it means not heritage for so many, but indeed it means hate? So again, very difficult to do this in a non-judgmental, open fashion, to try not to be condemnatory, to not say that they're wrong. But this is a space for learning, and to the extent that you need to practice these things beforehand about these issues, and they come in all different forms: affirmative action, race-based admissions in jobs and in schools, and a host of other issues that are going to come up. You have to prepare yourself, but don't let your lack of what you feel is learning on these issues stop you from having these conversations day one, fall 2020. All right, next slide, please. So the last slide is about debriefing, and this is critical because you can't just have a discussion like this and then the bell rings and everybody leaves and they're left with a spaghetti-like tangle of emotions and maybe they didn't get to say anything, or they were feeling angry and couldn't respond. So you have to ask, after you're done, leave 10 minutes for this at least. How's everyone feeling? Was this a helpful conversation? Would you like to continue it again? Anything I can do to improve mediating these conversations? If I've made mistakes, help me so I'm better the next time. Again, students are paying us to help them, to lead the way and how they can discuss race and be fluent in race-based issues in their lives. And I am confident that once we start doing this in all courses, all the time, that people will be more open and free, and we can all work towards dismantling the societal structures that are really preventing true equality. It's the work that we can all do together. And I thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that very informative presentation. Now we're going to spend some time addressing some of the questions from the audience. So please continue to send them into the question box on the right side of your screen, or use the Twitter hashtag SageTalks. If we can't get to all of the questions by the end of the hour, our speaker has agreed to address some of those questions in a follow-up blog post on the Sage blog. Yes, we have a lot of questions that have come through. There definitely are some themes within the questions. So a few questions that came through was, what do you consider a successful conversation about race?
So that's an excellent question. Non-closure, number one. That is, a successful conversation about race does not put it like in a box with a bow and tie it all up and say, whee, we're done. Wasn't that great? So successful resolution, conclusion, if you will, is to have students wanting to do it again, wanting to talk more, wanting to incorporate more knowledge, other reading, other events, not being afraid, not suffering just like, I just got to get through this. So that's the success. Just an acknowledgement that the work needs to continue. Great question.
Okay, next question is, what are some signs that you need an exit ramp during your conversations about race and racism?
If you've lost control, and that's going to be dependent on everybody's individual personality. What may be a loss of control for me in the classroom, again, I was a former death penalty lawyer, so my tolerance is exceptionally high for conflict. May not be the same for you, who's a physics teacher and wants to engage in this discussion because you need to know where your students are at. And so your tolerance and skill set to negotiate away from conflict may be less. But if you have lost control where students are attacking one another, not the statements that they're saying, they violated the group norms that we established at the beginning, and it's a free-for-all, that's the sign that you need an escape ramp. Please, 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 do not stop the conversation because of that, because the students will learn that they can bully you into silence.
Great. How should you respond if a student responds that this off-ramp is an attempt to silence them or suppress their voice?
Well, you can always say, oh, I'm sorry, and this is just active listening. I'm sorry, what am I not hearing? Please. And again, now, remember, you're going to have your students who want to dominate, and everyone has to speak once before somebody speaks twice. So if this person has already spoken, and working through the list, you can simply say, please, I'm going to wait for you to speak. But let's say that's happened now, okay? Everyone's spoken and people are talking and they're saying, you're not addressing it. You're shutting me down. The appropriate response in that situation is to say, what am I missing? I'm sorry. What do you, tell me what you want to say. I'm going to be willing and open to hear all voices because that's what this is. But then you don't let them go on for 20 minutes. What you say is let them say their piece and then point to another student. And again, this may be a little bit more difficult to police in an asynchronous online environment. But you may say, oh, well, Bob, what do you think about that? Do you have an opinion about what this student just said? Does anybody else, would anyone else like to contribute their thoughts on what this particular student said? So you want to always be inclusive with the group, and don't be afraid if at some point the group does break down over a particular issue. That may happen. That's why these conversations, you should dedicate an entire class period for them. You should not squeeze it in after you've sort of gone over the homework or given a test or something like that. You should model that this race-based discussion is the most important thing happening in the classroom that day.
Great, thank you. Exactly what do you mean by debriefing? What are specific debriefing steps?
So you want to ask everybody how they're feeling. Now, I don't want to share that, but you're saying, okay, we covered a lot of ground. This was our first attempt. I want to know how you're feeling about this. And again, always, always, always a safety net for you is to tie it back to current events. So, for example, we know that the election of 2020 is going to be a race-based flashpoint, especially because the president and his Twitter feed seem to exacerbate certain issues. Now, I'm telling you this because, again, I live in a very red area politically, and you always want to make sure that the students address sort of people in power with the correct title. And you're going to do this for them because they're not going to get a job and go call their manager, hey, Sue, what's going on? So I make sure that you refer to President Obama, President Trump. Okay. We're not going to attack the political candidates. That will lead to that's going to lead to a brawl. It may. And depending on whether you're a public institution or a private one, I'm in a public school, they have every right under the First Amendment to wear a Make American Great Again hat to wear t-shirts of the, of the Confederate flag. They have a right if they want to be offensive. And I'm not associating the president with offensive acts. That being said, he did tweet out something that said, had a video where one of his supporters screamed out, "White power." Okay, so in a debrief, depending on how everyone is feeling, I may go back to something that's current and say, what does it say in society? Okay, this is not a bad apple. President, we're not going to say he's a bad apple because he's supported by many. What does it say about government that on an official presidential Twitter feed, you tweet a video where someone says white power, and then you never disavow that? Okay, how does that make everybody feel in the context of what we've been discussing? So again, you always want to sort of pull back, so that you're not focused on individuals especially if they don't want to talk. So that's what you ask. Was this helpful? Ask if they thought it was helpful. Or did I do anything, did I make any mistakes or what I can do better? If you are uncomfortable doing this face-to-face, and I don't mean virtual, I give out white pieces of paper to every student and ask them questions to write it down anonymously. I do that rather than have them pull out their own notebooks because their notebook paper may be identifiable. So if you give everybody a white piece of paper and say, I'm going to ask you these questions, this is my debrief, then you can read them and then students may have some safety and anonymity. But you don't want to just end the discussion, have them walk out of the room, or if you're doing this online, to end the discussion board without this ability to process what they all experienced together as a group.
Thank you, Steph. Another question, are there any training materials you would recommend for faculty to engage in as a department?
Yes, so Jill and Jessica at Sage, we're in the process of getting these references to these types of materials. And let me just say, I've been through courageous conversations, this common ground, sustained dialogue. There are some that are better than others. So for faculty, I don't know what the makeup is of your faculty. One of the things I will say is you want to make sure that if you have faculty of color, you do not put all of this sort of training and enlightenment on their shoulders. Okay, so for example, I had to write, I'm the only Black person in my department. There are others of color, but I was the only one that wanted to come up with a statement to put on our Facebook homepage about the killing of George Floyd. Now, personally, should I have to do that? I'm hoping that my voice won't be alone by having these types of webinars. Others will join me. And I'm willing to do that, but I don't want to have to do that all the time. So to answer your question, any type of training that is out there, and there's a lot, and we will recommend some, make sure that it works for your individual space, because it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all. And I would resist what's going around now is a lot of people wanting you to hire them to have these conversations. You should check out their credentials. There's a lot of fly-by-night trainings being offered right now.
Thank you. Do you have any recommendations for teaching courses online and having these discussions?
So it depends on your course, but I always have a discussion board just for race-related issues. Of course, it's easy in my field of criminal justice to have that board be heavily populated at all times. I can talk about race and the death penalty. I can talk about race and rape statistics, sort of the Stanford rape case, with the swimmer Brock. And boy, was that an appropriate sentence versus an African-American who was charged and sentenced for a similar crime. So it's easy in my field. For those in literature and other types of social sciences, and again, business or the hard sciences, it's a little bit more difficult. But I think if you approach the class, especially as we begin in the fall, where many of us will be online because of COVID, you have the luxury of some time to plan how you want to introduce this, so it's not cold. So you could have it in your syllabus. You could offer extra credit, you know, whatever you could do to incentivize. But you're going to say, because of what's going on, we're going to be part of this transformative process, what's happening, and we're going to discuss race so that you don't avoid the topic like you've been allowed to do perhaps your entire life. In mixed company, if you will. We're going to address it head on, because now is the time to abolish this original sin that we've had that has guided so much of what we do in excluding Black people from the social intercourse of our daily lives.
Thank you. We have a question. I worry about conversations about race being traumatizing for students of color. Is this a valid worry? Do you have any thoughts regarding trauma?
It's a question. And I will say I am in the College of Human Services, and so I have counselors at my disposal to talk about trauma. Now, when I've had these discussions, it doesn't, my students of color, which do include Latinx, my Black students, they don't necessarily, I don't believe that they are triggered in a way to cause trauma, but I think people are surprised at the level of anger and resentment that, that they are expressing. And again, this is where privilege comes in, where they've been stopped by the police coming to campus. Their Black fraternity events get special extra police protection, but a white fraternity event does not. And these types of injustices can really twist people's souls. I recently wrote an op-ed about understanding the Black rage behind the looting. And of course, I'm not defending looters, but when Black people have been chatteled as property and they don't have much, they don't see destroying property in the same, you know, that gets people's attention. You know, the Watts riots, the riots after Rodney King, you know, this wholesale destruction. A lot of my students say, why are they destroying the communities in which they live? It's because it's the only outlet that they have for this accumulated rage that gets people's attention in a way that having a race-based conversation simply doesn't advance. And to end that point, I'll just say that I saw some news story about a discussion in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where they were talking about changing the name of the Robert E. Lee School. And there was a school board member, a white woman, and she was caught with her computer in front of her shopping. And this African-American man was essentially excoriating her for not listening to what he said. And this encapsulates what the experience is essentially for Black people. I don't even rate your full attention when I speak, because you're going to do whatever you want. That is structural racism. So my students, my Black students, rather than being triggered for trauma, it's actually cathartic for some of them to actually be heard by their white students in ways that don't happen outside of the classroom.
Great. Thank you. Probably the last question is, some instructors may not feel ready to take the risk of not doing this well for fear of their own already contingent job security. How would you respond to this?
That's an excellent question, and I'm very mindful of my adjunct brothers and sisters, my peeps without tenure. I would never want you to engage in any behavior, no matter what it is, or have any discussion that would put you on of a job. So let's be clear, though. I want to be able to distinguish job security versus I'm afraid and don't feel ready. I would, if I were in that situation, let's just say untenured, I would ask my senior faculty to join me in these discussions. At my first faculty meeting, I would say, you know, we have a thing at SHIP that's called Right Across the Curriculum, as in writing. Why don't we do something called Race Across the Curriculum? Why doesn't every single one of us look at our syllabi and see where we're going to discuss race during the semester? That can give you a level of protection. If indeed you're an adjunct and you don't think that you can take the political risk, don't. But I tend to believe in this environment, a university, community college, is not going to want to see the headline, I tried to talk about race and was fired. I tried to have an honest conversation about race and was kicked to the curb. I don't know how, if that fear is valid, but check it out. And again, don't conflate fear with I'm not ready. I implore you to get ready because, as I said at the beginning, and I'll end with this, silence is not an option. Silence in the classroom means you are okay with the racial status quo because you're unwilling to take it on and challenge it. And I think that because you're here, I know that we are not all okay with the status quo. So be courageous and go out and speak. And if you have any other questions, I am available. And I thank you all so very much for your attention. And as I said, your willingness to do the work.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for your informative presentation and answering those questions. That's about all the time we have for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And again, a special thank you to you, Stephanie. In the coming weeks, please be on the lookout for an email that will include a link to the entire webinar and the slides, as well as answers to some of the questions that we did not have time for today. Please stay connected with us on our blog, Sage Connection, for information about upcoming webinars. Thank you so much.